Hey everyone, welcome back to Bunny Call, the final story. This is going to be part 2 of 3 of The Man in Room 1280. So far, it's been a very strange story. We've had a priest visit, a dying man in a hospital with burns all over his body. He should be dead, but he's not, if that sounds familiar to you. Just very weird stuff, and I'm really excited to see how this continues. But the man has started communicating with Arthur, and he's told him to go to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, whatever is there. And the nurses in the room seem to recognize it because they had an interesting reaction to it. And so, now Arthur has an idea. There, you're all caught up, as if you didn't know anyway. Okay. I have an idea, he said, relieved that he did indeed have an idea. He could hear the nurses whispering in the doorway. He blocked them out. Why don't I make guesses about why this place is important to you? When I get to the right one, you can either raise a finger or just react so the monitors pick it up. The monitors hiccuped, and Arthur took that to be assent. He threw out his first guess. It's where you used to work. Nothing. You have family there. Nope. You have unfinished business there? No reaction. You hid something there. That guess made Arthur smile. It was a dead giveaway that he loved mystery and adventure books and movies. Arthur noticed the nurses had come farther into the room. Now they stood in a semicircle a couple of feet from the end of the bed. Arthur wondered why they were still there. If they thought what he was doing was so abhorrent, why didn't they just leave? It was the last place you were before you got hurt. No movement, no monitor reaction. You need something from there. Nothing. You've always wanted to go there? The monitors blipped so infinitesimally that Arthur thought he was imagining it. But what if he wasn't? Is this a place you want to go? The monitors reacted. He can't go any place, sweetie, the round nurse said. He can only go, someplace other than Earth. Arthur stood and walked over to the nurses. You mean hell? He whispered. Nurse Ackerman gave him one sharp head nod. The tanned nurse said, Well, duh. And the monitors in the room went crazy. Beeps were sounding so fast they blurred together into one long screech. Arthur turned back to the man. He suddenly understood. You want to go to this place before you die. The monitors all fell silent, completely silent. For 5 seconds, the only sound in the room was the combined breathing of Arthur, the nurses, and the man. And then the monitor started beeping in a normal rhythm again. Arthur turned back to the nurses. He wants to go to the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center before he dies. Impossible, Nurse Ackerman said. Arthur sat in a low-slung dark blue visitor's chair in front of a cluttered desk that belonged to the assistant of the Heracles Hospital administrator. Judging from the man's age, Arthur suspected he was more than 2 people removed from the person in charge. But that was okay. Arthur knew how to climb bureaucratic ladders. So, I'm not sure what you want, the assistant's assistant said. His name was Peter Fredericks. Call me Pete, he'd told Arthur. Pete's desk was in a corner cubicle in a room of similar cubicles, nowhere near the Heracles Hospital administrator's office. Most of the people in the cubicles were talking on the phones. Those who weren't on the phones were typing in their keyboards, and the room was filled with half-conversations and the click-click of typing. Arthur filtered out the sounds and focused on Pete. As I said, Pete, I want to know if there's anything in the file of the man in room 1280 that indicates why he might want to go to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center before he dies. Well, yes, you said that. Pete scratched the sparse facial hair on his chin. It appeared to be a failing attempt at a goatee, probably intended to cover up the acne there. But I don't know why you want to know, Pete said, in a voice that hadn't yet found an adult depth of tone. I want to know because it might help me make it happen for him. The man in room 1280 can't be moved. When Pete said man in room 1280, he looked down at his desk and chewed on his cuticles with great concentration. So I've been told, but nothing is impossible, Arthur replied. Moving him is. Arthur braced his hands on the too-soft cushion under his butt and maneuvered himself, with effort, forward in his seat. Pete, isn't the very existence of the man in room 1280 proof that nothing is impossible? If he can be in that room, still breathing, still able to communicate a desire, might it not be possible to fulfill that desire for him? Think about it, Pete. Pete glanced up at Arthur. His face was as white as the walls in the tiny cubicle. Pete was clearly thinking about the man in room 1280, and he didn't want to be. He looked down again, and he tapped the very thin file folder on the desk in front of him. An open container of Chinese food tipped against a stack of thicker folders and threatened to spill its contents. From the aroma, Arthur guessed it was sweet and sour chicken. Well, there's nothing in here. Nothing about Fazbear anything. I see, Arthur said. He battled the chair for a few seconds and finally managed to stand. Well then, I'll need to talk to someone who can give me permission to take the man to the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. I assume that's not you? Pete stood, bumped the thick stack of files on his desk, and spilled the Chinese food. Yep, sweet and sour chicken. Pete ignored the sticky mess on his desk and scurried after Arthur as he turned to leave. Grabbing the sleeve of Arthur's cassock, Pete said, "No one's going to give you permission." "We'll see," Arthur said. Arthur stepped out of the hospital and stood under the portico. He watched mist waft sideways in the steady southerly breeze. He and Ruby would be soaked by the time they got home. Not in a hurry to start his wet, cold journey, he scanned the black and silver mottled sky. There were no rays of sun to be seen now. Twilight hovered. Arthur took a deep breath of rain-cleansed air. He'd need a year's worth of such breaths to clear his olfactory system from the torments it had endured today. It wasn't kind to think about how bad the man in room 1280 smelled, but Arthur couldn't help it. After over 7 hours by the man's side, he thought the smell might never leave him again. Nurse Ackerman had tried to get Arthur to leave right after the man's communication breakthrough, but Arthur had refused. He spent the next 3 hours sitting with the man, praying, asking for help. Arthur needed to know if he was simply helping a tortured soul, or something else. He never got a clear answer, so in the absence of definitive evidence to the contrary, he chose to stay positive. This was a man who needed his help. "Hi, Father. Father Blythe." Arthur smiled. "Mia," he said as he turned. "How was your first day of work?" Arthur could probably have answered the question for her. Her ponytail had slid lower on her head, and dozens of strands had come loose to fly around her face. She kept blowing one of them away from her nose. Her mascara was smudged, and there was a blackish stain on her uniform. "It was okay, I guess. Well, not exactly okay. My dad used to say that when I asked him a question. Well, Mia, my Mia, that's what he called me. All one word like it was my name. He'd say, 'Well, Mia, my Mia, it was a day.' So I guess I had a day. It was a day." Arthur nodded. Sometimes all we can do is have a day. Mia tilted her head and studied Arthur. "I think you had a day too? Maybe?" Arthur nodded. "That I did." A group of boisterous men in soccer uniforms converged on the portico. They were mud and grass stained, and appeared to be celebrating a victory as they charged toward the hospital entrance. Arthur guessed one of their teammates had gotten injured. Mia stepped closer to Arthur when one of the men whistled at her. Arthur ushered her back to the friendly panicle flowers they'd stood next to that morning. Arthur couldn't believe he'd spent the whole day at Heracles. Peggy would be furious with him. He'd called her to have her reschedule his other appointments for the day. Now he was going to have to tell her to reschedule the rescheduling. "Have you been here all day?" Mia asked. "I was just thinking about that. Yes, I have. It wasn't my plan, but—" "Man plans, God laughs," Mia giggled, then covered her mouth. "Oh, I hope that's not like an insult or something for a priest." Arthur laughed. "No, not at all." They stood in silence and watched cars coming and going out of the portico. They both coughed when a loud diesel engine belched exhaust 3 feet away. Arthur's stomach growled, and he realized he hadn't eaten anything but a protein bar since he'd left the rectory. But Mia looked like she wanted to say something, so he lingered. Plus, he was just enjoying being in relatively fresh air looking at a lovely human being. "Father Blythe?" "Yes, Mia?" Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Mia looked around, then stepped closer to Arthur. Her hair smelled like ammonia, but her breath smelled like peppermint. "Father, do you believe in evil?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "I do." "Do you think there's evil in there?" Mia lifted a shoulder in the direction of the hospital. Arthur frowned. He believed evil was everywhere, but so was good. The eternal battle was waged daily, all over the world. "Why do you ask?" Mia wrinkled her nose and twisted her mouth. "Can I ask another question?" Arthur nodded. Did you spend the day with someone in the hospice wing? Arthur's frown grew deeper. What was she digging for? Well, telling her he was on the wing didn't reveal any confidences. Yes, I did. Why? Mia opened her eyes wide. Arthur could almost hear her brain cells shifting gears. I don't know about the nurses on that wing. I mean, besides me, but I don't feel like I'm really one of them yet. It's the others, you know. Nurse Ackerman and Nurse Colton and Nurse Thomas. Ah. So it's just that at the moment, a zippy red sports car whipped into the driveway under the portico and beeped its horn. Mia's face lit up when she saw it. That's my boyfriend. She blew the good-looking young man behind the wheel a kiss. She turned back to Arthur. Sorry, I need to go. Of course. Mia took a step toward the red car. But Mia? She turned. Some people have closed minds. Always keep yours open. She looked at him, her face as solemn as he'd seen it. I will, she promised. Bye, Father Blythe. Bye, Mia. Arthur watched the sports car whiz away, and he thought about the man in room 1280. His attempt to get answers in the hospital administration office and his brush-off by Pete made it clear Arthur wasn't going to find out why the man wanted to go to the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. But, no matter. That wasn't Arthur's business. It was just his job to ensure the man got there. However, that was easier said than done. Pete and Nurse Ackerman weren't the only ones at Heracles Hospital who thought such a trip was impossible. Arthur had a battle ahead. He just hoped he was on the right side of it. Mia's second day of work started weirdly. Unable to find her fellow nurses when she arrived at the nursing station for her assignments, Mia just shrugged and went from room to room checking on her patients. Mia didn't love taking care of hospice patients because she had too much empathy for the families. She knew they often suffered even more than the patients. But she did find the work satisfying when she did it right. She wouldn't have minded the new job so much if it wasn't for the other nurses. And the other thing. Mia shook her head and strode briskly down the hall. Popping in and out of rooms, she checked IVs, adjusted pillows, filled pitchers, and emptied urine collection bags. When she reached the last room she'd been told to attend to the day before, room 1200, she wondered why the rest of the doors in the strangely long hall were closed. She lingered in the hallway just outside the last open door. A storage room was across from her, its door slightly open. Then Mia saw a shadow flit past that opening. Sucking in a deep breath, Mia tiptoed across the hall, making sure her crepe soles didn't squeak on the tiles. She hesitated outside the storage room. She was about to open the door and investigate when she heard voices. She knew immediately that she'd found her fellow nurses. Mia was about to walk in and ask what was going on, but then she heard the word, kill. Mia went as still and silent as the floor she stood on. She took a stealthy step to the wall and pressed against it as she put her ear to the sliver of an opening at the hinged side of the door. I suppose we must, Nurse Thomas said. Someone has to do it, Nurse Colton said. I don't have a problem with it. It's not like murder because it's not human. It's extermination, said Nurse Ackerman. We're doing nothing more or less than ridding the hospital of vermin. Oh, I think it's much more, Nurse Thomas said. Don't you? Killing rats or cockroaches is good, of course, but ridding the world of evil? That's more than pests removal, that's a calling. It's heroic. Nurse Thomas's voice had climbed to a new level of self-righteousness. Heroic? Mia's fingers twitched. She wanted so bad to throw the door open and ask what these three odd women were talking about. Well, I agree with you both, Nurse Ackerman said, but others won't see it quite the same way. Technically, he's one of our patients. They were going to kill a patient? Mia looked around. What should she do? They don't pay me enough to call that thing a patient, Nurse Colton said. I don't need people to understand. I know what's right. Killing evil is right. Nurse Colton must have been standing close to the door, because her body odor nearly blotted out the smells of bleach and wood polish that usually emanated from the storage room. Mia hoped she didn't have any telltale odors or scents herself. She caught the end of her ponytail and inhaled, but only got a faint whiff of her conditioner. Absolutely, Nurse Thomas continued. Mia dropped her ponytail and returned to listening. Then we're agreed, Nurse Ackerman said. The women must have been nodding because they went silent. I'll be the one who does it. I'm head nurse. It's my responsibility, Nurse Ackerman declared. We'll do whatever you need us to do, Nurse Colton offered. I'll need morphine, Nurse Ackerman said. "I can fudge the tracking," said Nurse Colton. "We can take a little here and a little there from the other patients," Nurse Thomas added. "We have to hurry," Nurse Ackerman said. "We don't know how quickly that priest will move. He's determined enough to get the hospital to cave, and we have to get this done before the thing in room 1280 can leave." The nurses must have nodded again, and now Mia could hear faint rustles from inside the storage room. She decided she'd better go. Pushing off from the wall, Mia took a step, and that's when she saw what she'd been trying to convince herself she hadn't seen before. A little boy slithered out from the storage room. He came sideways through the slim door opening. Mia slapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She gritted her teeth, exasperated with herself. She'd had the same reaction when she'd seen this boy just the day before. But he was only a little boy, a cute and playful little boy. With his curly black hair and rosy cheeks, the boy's adorable factor was diminished, slightly, by just two things. First, he wore a cheap alligator mask that covered his forehead and his eyes. The gator's mouth rested on the boy's impish nose. Second, the boy had a toothy grin, just a little too devilish to be endearing. One notch past acceptable on the scale of mischief. But he was a little boy, and little boys like to look like this. Mia's cousin, Lucas, was a case in point. The child always looked like he was up to no good, and he usually was. So why did this boy make Mia want to scream? Before she could answer her own question, the boy winked at her and scampered down the hall. Mia turned to watch, but realized the nurses were about to exit. Mia darted toward the open door of the last patient she'd attended before loitering outside the storage room, looking for the boy again. But he was gone. When Mia burst into room 1200, Mr. Nolan, the room's occupant, looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Hello, Nurse Vermont," he said. "How fortuitous. What is another word for hell? 6 letters, starts with an S." "Shades," Mia blurted, wondering why the word was on the tip of her tongue. Mr. Nolan, whose gaunt face was haunted by the sunken eyes of the soon-to-be-gone from this world, slowly wrote in his puzzle book, "Exactly right. You're an angel." It took 2 days for Nurse Ackerman to acquire enough morphine for her task. At least, she hoped it was enough. She wasn't actually sure what enough was, in this case. Normal treatment dosages versus overdoses had never been relevant to the man in room 1280. Nothing about him was normal, so there was no reason to assume medication would affect him the same as it would other humans of his size and weight. Allowing for this, Nurse Ackerman and her colleagues gathered enough extra morphine to kill an entire wing of evil patients. She figured she'd start with what she thought might work and add to it as necessary. As soon as she had a quantity of morphine that gave her at least some level of confidence in the success of her mission, she didn't waste any time. A friend who worked in admin had informed Nurse Colton that Father Blythe was being relentless in his campaign to get the man in room 1280 to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. Nurse Ackerman strode down the long hallway, her rubber sole smacking the tiles. Her thoughts about Father Blythe made her footsteps even louder than usual. She clenched her fists. She was so angry with the man. How could Father Blythe be so clueless and blind? Couldn't he see he was being duped, being used as a tool for wickedness? Wasn't the very place the man wanted to visit a clue? Nurse Ackerman had researched Fazbear Entertainment, and she was alarmed by what she found. The company's distribution center was its central hub for all Fazbear-related toys, costumes, and decor. It shipped to restaurants and specialty and retail stores. She'd looked at some of those toys and costumes, and they were unsettling, to say the least. What better container for pure malevolence than some creepy toy? Nurse Ackerman suspected that whatever was inside the man in room 1280 had a plan that needed to be stopped. Checking over her shoulder one more time, Nurse Ackerman picked up her pace. She hoped she'd have enough time to finish the job at hand before Nurse Vermont finished her lunch. Nurse Vermont was the other challenge the nurses had to handle. The timing of her addition to the hospice wing roster was unfortunate. She was just a little too perky, a little too energetic for comfort. Nurse Ackerman had given Nurse Vermont a little test on her first day, talking about the man in room 1280 and Father Blythe in the break room while Nurse Vermont ate. If she'd turned and asked what they were talking about, they'd have included her. But she just eavesdropped, and Nurse Ackerman didn't trust eavesdroppers. At the doorway to room 1280, Nurse Ackerman paused. She looked behind her. The hallway was empty. It was time. Putting her shoulders back, Nurse Ackerman entered the room. She even considered closing the door, but she couldn't do it. None of the nurses had ever closed themselves inside room 1280. Quite frankly, they were afraid to. She only needed a minute, anyway. Crossing to the loathsome thing in the bed, Nurse Ackerman took out her first glass vial of morphine and thrust it onto the needle end of her syringe. She ignored the flutters of excitement that danced all over her skin. It wasn't that she was eager to kill. It was just that it would be such a relief to rid her hospice wing, her hospital, her world, of this stain upon mankind. With a steady hand, Nurse Ackerman injected the first of the morphine into the man's IV port. She watched the heart monitor. Its rhythm didn't falter. She had suspected this would happen. Smoothly, she pulled out the second vial. That's when she heard the giggle. Nurse Ackerman pivoted toward the door, but no one was there. Stepping away from the bed, she went to the door and looked out into the hallway. Had Nurse Vermont finished her lunch? The hallway was empty. Then Nurse Ackerman heard another giggle, and this time it was behind her. A blast of cold rushed down her spine and tightened into a vice grip in her bowels. Slowly, as if about to face a wild animal she didn't want to spook, Nurse Ackerman turned. She didn't know what she expected to see. She was prepared for literally anything. How could she not be? Anyone who had the man in room 1280 as a patient would have to be ready for anything. But she saw nothing. Everything was just as it had been when she entered the room. Even so, she stood next to the man for several moments just to be sure, watching him to see if she could discern a change. She couldn't. Well, that wasn't true. She did discern one change. The smell in the room was worse now than it had been when she first came in. It had intensified, as if someone had been fiddling with the hospital's thermostat and had allowed the room to heat significantly. The odor was ghastly. She'd better get on with it. Nurse Ackerman still held the second vial of morphine, so she quickly inserted her syringe and emptied it into the IV port. Again, she watched. And again, nothing. Nurse Ackerman straightened her spine and pulled the rest of the morphine vials from her pocket. 11 more. She laid them on the edge of the bed in a tidy row. She'd inject them all if she had to, one right after the other. She wasn't going to wait for a result. Reaching for the third vial, she heard the giggle again. Her hand stopped in mid-air. The giggle came from right next to her. A little black-haired boy stood by her side looking up. He was grinning a grin so feral that it acted like a siphon, extracting the strength from Nurse Ackerman's limbs. She felt herself start to crumple toward the floor, and she caught herself on the edge of the bed just in time. He was just a little boy. Why was she so afraid? He ran out of the room, and Nurse Ackerman tried to steady her racing heart rate. She needed to get herself under control so she could return to what she needed to do. But her mind, her memories, wouldn't let her find calm. Instead, she was transported, wholly against her will, into her past. She was deposited next to the bed of her dying son, the one who had left this world and had taken with him every smile Nurse Ackerman might have ever smiled. Feeling the agony as if she was living it, Nurse Ackerman experienced for the millionth time that moment when her son's death had reached into her heart and had torn it apart. She hadn't always been the shell of a woman, but Elijah's death had carved her out, leaving a barely functioning person to find a place among living beings who tortured her with reminders of the life she'd once shared with her son. Even though her heart was frozen, she had become a hospice nurse to help others who had to walk in her shoes. Stop this right now, she admonished herself. She didn't have time for this misery. Nurse Ackerman pushed aside her past, along with the question of who the little boy was and why he was here. She also boxed up the puzzle of why he was so terrifying. One thing at a time, she told herself. Once again, she reached for a vial. Before her fingers could close around it, though, a child-sized shadow flashed in front of her. As it streaked by, all the vials flew off the bed and hurtled toward the floor, where they shattered on impact. Morphine puddled innocuously on the tiles. Nurse Thomas's plan was simple, because Nurse Thomas was simple. A lover of growing flowers, cooking her family large, fattening dinners, and needle-pointing Bible verses, Nurse Thomas, Beatrice to her friends, had become a nurse because she loved people, simply loved them. She wanted to serve them however she could. These truths about Nurse Thomas were a little counter to where she currently was and what she was currently doing. Right now, she stood outside room 1280, holding a pillow that she intended to use as a weapon. But really, Nurse Thomas's goals were all congruent, she told herself. What she was about to do was an act of love as pure and simple as she was. Beatrice was doing this for the same reason she did everything every day. She was doing it to help people. Nurse Thomas looked over her shoulder. She was alone. Just because she was doing this to help doesn't mean she wanted to be seen doing it. No one besides Nurse Ackerman and Nurse Colton seemed to understand. Pausing to say a short prayer outside of room 1280, Nurse Thomas hugged the pillow and then opened the door. She ducked her head as soon as she was in the room. She always did this in room 1280. It was a way of seeing well enough to do what she needed to do without having to look too closely at what was in the bed. She didn't want to look at what was in the bed because it was the most grotesque thing she'd ever seen. A macabre conglomeration of writhing slime and fire-branded dross, the man-shaped mass of bone and tissue in the bed literally made Nurse Thomas's eyes burn, as if she was looking at a solar eclipse without shades. This effect was so intense that she'd even tried wearing sunglasses in this room to see if they'd help. Which they didn't. Breathing through her mouth, because Nurse Ackerman was right, the smell was much worse than before, Nurse Thomas approached the head of the bed. Giving the pillow one last squeeze, she held it in two hands, out in front of her. She knew that Nurse Ackerman and Nurse Colton had both thought her idea for killing this thing in this bed was silly. Maybe it was. But sometimes the easiest solution was the best one. Morphine hadn't worked, that was for sure. Nurse Thomas and her fellow nurses had spent an hour the night before discussing the little boy Nurse Ackerman had seen. Both Nurse Thomas and Nurse Colton had seen him too. They even got Nurse Vermont to admit that she'd spotted him. Nurse Thomas didn't think Nurse Vermont had told them everything about what she'd seen, but she'd told them enough. Earlier today, Nurse Thomas had overheard a couple of orderlies talking about how people were seeing a little black-haired boy all over the hospital. The mystery of the boy wasn't necessarily related to room 1280. Or was it? After Nurse Vermont went home, and after handing over the hospice wing to the swing shift, the three nurses had shared coffee in the cafeteria, and discussed the question that was even more important than the boy. "What do you think that shadow was?" Nurse Thomas had asked Nurse Ackerman as she tried to ignore all the food smells in the room. She was hungry and couldn't wait to get home to cook macaroni and cheese and green bean casserole. "I think it was it. Whatever's inside that man." "How did it get out?" Nurse Thomas asked. "I can't explain any of this." Nurse Ackerman's voice was so loud it startled several nurses and doctors sitting nearby. Forks clattered. Someone dropped a glass. She immediately dropped her voice to a whisper. "Doesn't matter. What matters is we need to try again." That's when Nurse Thomas volunteered her homespun little plan. She'd smother the man in room 1280 with a pillow. Nurse Ackerman had wanted to try again with morphine, but Nurse Thomas convinced her that the man in room 1280, or whatever was inside the man in room 1280, would be ready for that. They needed to take him, or it, by surprise. So here she was. The previous night, Nurse Thomas had practiced. She'd done a bit of research, and she discovered it took about 3 minutes to suffocate someone with a pillow. She had to find out if she could hold a pillow forcefully over something for that long, or even longer. Learning from Nurse Ackerman's experience, Nurse Thomas figured that if normally lethal doses of morphine didn't kill the thing, suffocation would take extra effort as well. Nurse Thomas looked pillowy herself, but she wasn't. Hours of cooking, cleaning, gardening, and needlework had given her unexpected upper body strength. The strength came in handy when she did her pillow experiment on a doll she'd bought for a niece. She had no problem holding a pillow over the doll for 7 minutes, although her muscles were burning a little by the time she was done. She'd received the strength she needed now, she was sure. Nurse Thomas took a step toward the bed. She paused and listened, but there was no giggling of the kind Nurse Ackerman had described. Apparently the boy wasn't around. Tightening her grip on the pillow, Nurse Thomas marched to the bed and shoved it down hard over the man's face, or at least over where his face should have been. Nurse Thomas's muscles were tensed, poised, and ready for anything. Yet nothing happened. At first. Then the pillow started filling with blood. It came through the middle of the pillow and soon began spreading outward, seeping inexorably toward Nurse Thomas's fingers. But she didn't let go. She was focused on the end result. After 6.5 minutes, the monitor's steady beep, beep, beep picked up its pace. Then, glory be, after another minute it shifted to the sustained tone of a flat line. She was doing it. Just a few more seconds should be enough. The pillow was almost fully saturated with blood, and now Nurse Thomas noticed a sickly green fluid was coming through the pillow as well. She gagged, but kept pressing. That's when a shadow darted in front of Nurse Thomas and tore the pillow from her grasp. Before she could even think about trying to retrieve it, the pillow ruptured, its contents ejecting into the room and all over her. Sticky, odious blood went into her mouth and up her nose. Putrid slime flew into her eyes, and bits of cloth and foam stuck to the fluids that sluiced all over her skin and coagulated in her hair. Nurse Thomas didn't make a sound, but the monitors did. They shifted from a steady flatline tone back to a stable, even rhythm. Nurse Thomas fainted in the middle of the sickening mess on the floor. Arthur was getting frustrated. He didn't often get frustrated because he believed in universal timing, but that timing seemed a little off right now. It was now 5 days since the man in room 1280 had been able to communicate with him. Since then, Arthur had been back to see the man daily, although he'd only stayed a couple hours each time. The rest of the time he was at the hospital. He was in the administration offices, trying to get someone to listen to him. What harm could it do, he'd said over and over to at least a dozen different people. He simply couldn't understand why moving the man in room 1280 was such a bad thing. Either he'd survive the experience and get whatever it was he wanted from his visit to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, or he wouldn't. And if he didn't, well, Arthur couldn't help but think that would be a mercy. The hospital administration didn't agree. They also were distracted. It seemed that the whole hospital was abuzz about repeated sightings of a little dark-haired boy wearing an alligator mask. Dozens of people had seen the boy, but thus far, no one had been able to talk to him. The police had been called in to find the boy and figure out where he was belonged. But none of the officers ever spotted him. Every time the boy was seen, and officers rushed to the location reported, the boy was gone before the officers arrived. Meanwhile, patients and staff had seen the boy in locations all over the hospital. Apparently, a janitor even saw him in the hospital's basement, near the backup generators. As far as the hospital administration and the police could determine, no one was missing a child who matched his description. Because no one had spoken with the boy, and no one had been able to grab him, people were now wondering whether he was a ghost. A ghost in an alligator mask, of all things. But that wasn't Arthur's business. He had his own problems to solve. And today he was taking a breather from arguing with hospital personnel. He was having lunch with Mia. "Here I am," Mia called, as she wove her way through the wooden picnic tables in the outdoor eating area of the cafeteria. The tables were set up on pinkish stone pavers, within a larger patio lined with stone planters filled with orange and yellow mums. A half-dozen dark-eyed juncos and a couple of sparrows hopped among the flowers. The sun had reasserted its dominance over the sky, and it was lighting up all of fall's jewel colors, turning the trees surrounding Heracles Hospital into masterpieces of brilliant reds, yellows, and oranges. Only the faintest of breezes made the tree branches sway, and the leaves on the ground gambol about. It was a glorious day. Mia's bright presence made it even better. "I hope you haven't been waiting long," Mia said. "Not at all." Truthfully, Arthur had been here for 25 minutes, but she was only 15 minutes late. "I also hope you didn't bring your lunch, because my boyfriend made these amazing provolone and corned beef sandwiches." "Oh, you're not a vegetarian, are you? Or can you eat corned beef? Is it kosher or whatever?" Arthur smiled. "I'm not a vegetarian," he said. "Oh, good," Mia replied. She pulled out 2 thick sandwiches on hoagie rolls, both tightly wrapped in plastic, and handed one to him. "So, how's it going with admin?" she asked, as soon as she'd taken that bite and washed it down with the soda. "It's not," admitted Arthur. Taking the fact that he'd run into Mia every day he'd been at the hospital as a sign of encouragement, Arthur had finally told her he was trying to get permission to take a patient out of the hospital to a place the patient had requested to visit. Mia had surprised Arthur when she responded, "Oh, the man in room 1280? "How'd you know?" he asked. "I overheard Nurse Ackerman and the others talking about him, and they caught me listening, so they told me about him. I haven't seen him yet or anything. They say I'm not ready for that. I think I'm more ready than they think I am, but whatever, I'm plenty busy." She took a bite of sandwich. "I'm not sure you're ready either," Arthur said. He hated the idea of this cheerful girl having to see... But, wait, that wasn't very kind, was it? The man couldn't help what he looked like. Arthur bit into his sandwich and immediately knew why. Mia was so crazy about her boyfriend. The man was a sandwich saint. "This is amazing," he said. "I know, right?" She grinned. They both chewed for a few seconds. When Mia finished chewing, she said, "The man in room 1280 is that bad, huh?" Arthur shrugged. "I've overheard them talking about other things, too," Mia said. "Who?" he asked. "Nurse Ackerman and the others." Mia was quiet for a minute, so Arthur prompted her. "What other things?" Mia bit her lower lip. Then she waved a hand. It doesn't matter. She took a drink of soda. You've heard about the boy, right? Arthur laughed. How could I not? Everybody's talking about him. I saw him, Mia said. Was she bragging? Really? At least 4 times so far, always wearing that silly mask. Arthur settled in with his sandwich and listened to Mia describe the curly-haired boy with the devilish grin. He had to admit mild curiosity about the child. Arthur himself hadn't seen him, but that was okay. You know, Mia said, you could use the boy to your advantage. How? Arthur wasn't a fan of using anyone, much less a little boy, but he figured he might as well hear what Mia had to say. He found her voice to be as comforting as one of Peggy's hot toddies on a cold night. Well, the whole thing is causing a massive paperwork for the people in admin. It's a nightmare to document all the sightings and coordinate with the police, I'm sure. Why don't you suggest you're going to follow them around and bug the heck out of them unless they let you take the man to where he wants to go? I used to do that when I was a kid. If you just keep asking and keep pestering people when they're really busy, they'll eventually say yes just to get rid of you. Works like a charm. She laughed and bit into her sandwich. Arthur thought about it for a second. That's not a bad idea. Mia grinned. She had a piece of lettuce caught between her 2 front teeth. On her, it was charming. Nurse Colton had a plan she was sure was better than those of Nurse Ackerman and Nurse Thomas. It had the advantage of being both simple and sophisticated. It could also be lethal. She expected, assuming she weren't thwarted by the mysterious shadow that had derailed the actions of her fellow conspirators. But, unlike Nurse Ackerman and Nurse Thomas, Nurse Colton expected the shadow to intervene. She had a plan to stop it. Nurse Thomas had been homesick for 2 days. Neither Nurse Ackerman nor Nurse Colton knew whether the sickness was physical or psychological. Obviously, anyone who'd experienced a monstrous deluge of foul bodily fluids, like those that had drenched Nurse Thomas, had a right to get a little hysterical. Fainting seemed like an appropriate reaction. Nurse Colton didn't begrudge Nurse Thomas at all for just escaping consciousness for a while. Nurse Colton and Nurse Ackerman had both been masked, gowned, and gloved when they'd cleaned up the detonated pillow. They'd also put camphor on their upper lips to dampen the smells. However, they'd both gagged repeatedly for the hour it took to clean the room. And Nurse Thomas. What was the shadow? That was a discussion the 3 women had at Nurse Thomas's house the previous evening. They decided it was an extension of the thing in the bed. Or what was on the bed. This was why Nurse Colton thought she knew what she had to do about it. She had some experience with this sort of thing, and she felt pretty good about her plan. And that's where we're going to end it for now. Sorry, guys, but don't worry, because the next part will be the last part. So we're almost there. That will be the grand finale of this book. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the end. In the meantime, let me know what you think. I'm really curious to read your suggestions, your comments, your theories. But they're just theories. Just game theories. Just game theories. Sorry about that. In the meantime, maybe like, maybe subscribe. If you've gotten this far, and you still haven't subscribed, I mean, come on. Come on, for real. Whatever. Anyway, goodbye. I'm done.